just want to talk a little bit about some examples of visualization in practice. So basically, some real applications that have used that we've done visualization and analysis for. So this first one, I alluded to it a bit earlier. It's a simulation of blood flow, and they start with MRI data of a real patient, and this patient has an aneurysm. And so what they're interested in is looking at the effects of the large-scale flow patterns and how those impact particle behavior that's going on in the small subregion on the end of the aneurysm there that could potentially cause the aneurysm to burst or a chunk of a clot that's forming to break free, cause obstruction downstream. And so this is a problem where they couple two different simulation codes. They're using a finite element code for doing fluid flow for the large scale, and then they're also coupling that with a particle dynamics code for doing particle behavior. And so you see there's these platelet particles that are building up in this region that's actually along the wall of the aneurysm there.
So what would the particles represent?
So in this particular case, there's several different types of particles. Some of them are platelet particles. Others are, as you'll see, I think, I have an example of...
The components of the blood, basically?
Correct. And we're using lamps for doing that. And so the two codes are, as I said, they're coupled and they talk to each other and influence one another.
So they're particle fluid or something?
Right. So for the spectral element code that's doing the flow, it's a spectral element code called Nek Tar, and it's consists of these overlapping elements. So a bunch of these tetrahedrals that don't overlap, and they use a multi-level approach or multi-patch where there's a small overlapping region of elements that they do where they couple the two mathematically so that they do exchange only in that overlap region to ensure that the flow from one subregion to the next is correct. And that data is saved in modal space. And the data consists of the geometry, a mesh of the geometry data, and then the solution data, which is essentially for each element or each vertice on the map of the element has the particular values for example, pressure and velocity. And so one of the things we talked about before when I spoke about this a little bit earlier is that there's a need to do data conversion from the format that it's in for doing the simulation is often not the same format that it's needed to be in to do visualization. So originally, this team had a utility that they used to do this conversion from their spectral element space to VTK, and they would write that VTK out to disk and then read it into ParaView. And so I worked with them to write a custom reader plugin for ParaView, which basically reads their spectral element data in directly in its native format and does this conversion on the fly and then pushes the data into the ParaView pipeline. And then you can leverage all of the visualization and rendering power of ParaView in parallel and use Nek Tar for doing parallel and computation. So, and I'll show a little bit, a slide in a second that kind of shows why that's important. So there's some controls on the GUI that enable you to say which variables you want to load, and additionally, there's capabilities for calculating derived quantities, and you can also change the resolution of the elements that you want to display. And so there's an example of, it's probably hard to see on this top image, but you can see how the bottom image is much denser between these two, where we've increased the resolution of the individual elements. And so that calculation is done using the native Nek Tar libraries. And so here's an example of where I was saying that it was important to be able to get access to the finite element data directly for doing, for example, here we're calculating vorticity. And so the image on the left is we're reading the velocity and pass the velocity values off to, on a grid off to pair view, and then it calculates the vorticity. And on the right, because we have access to the original finite element data, we're able to calculate those values on higher order and get a more accurate result by doing it in the native format in the spectral element. And then this is just an example of some additional quantities. We calculate the wall shear stress. And more recently, we've been working with them. Initially, all of the mesh was static, and now more recent examples of calculations they've been doing, the mesh is actually dynamic. So they're coupling this fluid and structure, the fluid and doing fluid structure interaction where the flow inside the artery is actually deforming the mesh. And in this case, I'll show an example. This is one where it's deformed, kind of hard to tell. So that's just both of them together. And the way that we implemented that was the mesh itself, the connectivity doesn't change. So we read that in once at the beginning, and then essentially the deformation on the mesh is just another scalar field in the data. So we read in the deformation values and apply them to the original mesh without having to recalculate the connectivity and partitioning of the mesh. And this is just another example of additional derived quantities that are calculated. These regions here are where there's the stress tensor, where there's high stress on the walls, and indicate where, places where there's high stress and likely to have problems. So another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is that, so visualization isn't always just for, the pretty pictures at the end. One of the ways that we also use it is for doing verification that their calculations are correct. So for example, this is the same aneurysm data set, and here we put a cutting plane through the center of the aneurysm at the place where this little spot here is, that's where the subdomain is. And so we have a cutting plane that's at the boundary between the two domains. And so this is the smaller subdomain. And then this is an image looking at, again, this is a cutting plane where those two domains meet. And this black box is showing this part of the cutting plane is from the smaller subdomain calculated by the LAMPS, the particle dynamics data calculation. And the region outside is calculated by the fluid dynamics code. And so you can see it's pretty consistent. And again, the arrows that are there, the purple ones on the inside are inside the box were calculated by one code. The orange ones are calculated by the other, and you can see that they match up. And then also, visualization can be a very useful tool for debugging. So the same code that we use for doing the fluid flow, they have another application for, these are actually marine propellers, and they're looking at flow around these propellers. And they're having some anomalies that they didn't quite understand in their results. And so, so I took a look at it, and if you watch these two propellers, so the one on the right is actually in the front, and the front of the flow is going this way. And these two propellers are rotating in opposite directions. But as you see, as we step through, watch the propeller in the front. they had something in their code that was not initializing things correctly, and eventually the front one disappeared altogether. And so you can see how that could be problematic. Right, so this is an example of once they figured that out, you can kind of see a little bit at the beginning here. These white regions is where the propeller actually is, and then this is the flow that's going around it and the turbulence that's being caused by it. So this is the cosmology example that Tom was just talking about, and this is volume visualization of those this is 1.1 trillion particles projected onto a regular grid, and so the regular grid we projected onto a 10K cubed, so 10,000 on a side, and the image on the left is of a slab of that data, which is about 10K by 10K by 800, which is the data from one I/O node, and the image on the right is essentially the data from output from a single process. And as you can see, it's from this tiny little part in the corner, so it's really a really big data set. But another way that we used visualization in this case was for doing some diagnostics. So in this case, so here's a little chunk of this data where we're doing volume rendering, as I showed earlier, and we are coloring it by its density value, but we wanted to speed up this processing for doing the volume rendering, and so we were looking at adding threads to it. And we weren't getting the performance we were expecting, so instead of coloring the data by its actual value, we colored it by the thread, the ID of the thread that was doing the processing. So we did by looking at different ways of arranging the data and arranging the assignment of data to threads, we can see sort of get a better idea of how the processing is being done and how things were parallelized. And so I don't remember which one of these four was the best performing one, but we saw distinct performance differences based on the way the data was laid out in terms of which threads were doing processing which parts of the data. And then this is just another quick example of looking at how the data is laid out. So within peer review and visit, I think Dave kind of showed an example of this earlier where you can color the data by the process ID of the process that's the process that's working on the data. And so this is another simulation where we looked at a large number of elements, and we were trying to figure out optimal decomposition of the elements across all the processes. And so this was one of the better ones, and this was a poor one. So this was basically, we did a round robin of element to process, and so you can see it's very jumbled up and not very efficient. And so using visualization to convey what that layout looks like was another tool that we found useful.